Hello, and welcome back to Quarantining in Quarryville. I'm your host, and today Wait, what's this? I have a real sous chef on the line today? Folks, this is Steven from Mrs. Kreider's afternoon kindergarten class, and he is going to be helping me make some pancakes. This method comes from Alton Brown, the foremost chef and food educator in existence to my mind, and you can find this recipe on his blog. But do note that we are going to be making a double batch today, so all amounts will be doubled. Now, to make pancakes, you're going to need 4 simple ingredients: buttermilk, eggs, butter, and a dry mix, which we'll get to later. We're going to start by melting the butter, which you could do in the microwave, but I prefer to do on the stovetop. This butter needs to be melted but at room temperature, lest we risk scrambling our eggs. To accomplish this, I put it into the freezer once all the butter is melted, taking it out to swirl around every few minutes and checking the pot for temperature. It takes less than 5 minutes to come back to room temp. You can also go ahead and turn on your oven to the lowest bake setting and get your griddle heating to about 400 degrees. While your eggs are heating and cooling, go ahead and measure out your dry ingredients. Alton gives the measurements for a bulk supply of this pancake mix, of which a single recipe requires 10 ounces by weight. Since we're making a double batch today, we're going to measure out 20 ounces. Note that several of the measurements are given by weight. Measuring things by weight is much more precise than by volume, and it's actually a lot easier. Just make sure you use the tare function between each ingredient to get your scale back to 0. If you don't have a kitchen scale, I'll leave a link to this one in the description. It's by far my favorite that I've ever bought. Now, there's actually some prep going on here that you can't see, and that is that we've allowed our dairy to all come up to room temperature. That means we let our considerable amount of buttermilk to sit on the counter for a few hours, and yes, that does mean we're having pancakes for dinner.
Thank you, darling.
Why would anybody ever eat anything besides breakfast food?
People are idiots, Leslie.
Well, yes, Ron. Now for the eggs, these are actually farm fresh eggs we bought locally and thus are not refrigerated. Eggs have a natural coating on them called a cuticle, and it does a very good job of keeping the nasties away from the product inside. In Europe, eggs are commonly sold this way, and you'll typically see eggs sitting on the counter, where they'll fare quite nicely for a few weeks. However, to keep the cuticle, you have to forgo washing the eggs, which can also mean leaving on other remnants of the chicken coop, which aren't so nice to look at or smell. So in America, supermarkets provide us with nicely washed eggs, which are clean, but that washing process also removes the cuticle, which is why we have to refrigerate our eggs. Regardless, you'll want some washed, room temperature eggs for your pancakes. The fussiest part of this recipe involves separating the eggs for beating before reuniting the ingredients. If you have an egg separator, go ahead and use it, but I've found the trusty pass back and forth between the shells method to work just fine. You'll want the whites in with the buttermilk and the yolks in with the melted butter. Give those yellows a nice tiny whiskin and the whites a nice regular whiskin. Then you can combine all the wets together and mix thoroughly. Why beat these things separately first, you may ask? Well, beating the yolks and butter together allows the fats in each to create an emulsion, while beating the whites into the buttermilk creates some lift from the whipped egg whites that will serve your pancakes well. And all this mixing explains why room temperature ingredients are important. If the butter was too hot, it would scramble the eggs, while if the eggs or buttermilk were too cold, they would start to solidify our barely melted butter. The last step before pouring is to mix the wet and dry stuff together. This is a much more important step in the making of good pancakes than most people realize, because if you overmix your pancakes, the final texture is not going to be very good. The more mixing you do, the more the starches in the flour will create gluten, and while gluten is great for creating a nice chewy chocolate chip cookie, a chewy pancake is not really what we want. So try to do more folding than mixing with your whisk, and walk away after about a 10 count of mixing. There will be lumps in the mix, but that's okay. The next step is to leave the mixture for 5 minutes and allow the wet activation of your leaveners to start to work. By that time, your griddle should definitely be up to temp. Pour a small amount of water onto the surface. If it skittles across the surface and quickly evaporates, you're ready to go. Now, a lot of people prefer the ladle style of putting out pancakes, but I still use the sometimes a bit messy direct pour method. Now, the first pancake or so is always going to be of lower quality than the rest of the batch, and these are coming out entirely too thick for my preference. That's not really unexpected, however, because different brands of flour are going to absorb different amounts of the wet ingredients. If yours is too thick, like this, just add a little more buttermilk and lightly mix it in. This is also the time when I add some fruit to the batter. Just drop your blueberries into each cake and let them set until the bubbles around the edge of each pancake have just begun to set. At that point, it's time to flip. Now, if you're making a double batch like we are, your early pancakes are going to be done much sooner than the later ones, which is why we turned the oven on low earlier. As you pull the stacks up, whoa! As you pull stacks of pancakes off the griddle, you can put them in a plate in the oven to stay toasty while the rest of the batch is being cooked. We typically serve pancakes with some sausage links and maple syrup, and it's always a big hit. Don't worry if you made too many. They heat up great in the toaster so long as you didn't make them too big. But whatever you end up cooking, make sure you stay home and stay safe. I will if you will.